Hello, my name is Carla Sanchez Adams. I'm a senior attorney with the National Consumer Law Center. And today I'm going to be talking about coerced debt and identity theft for the North Texas Coerced Debt Pilot Program. Today, you will learn about how to define identity theft under Texas law and understanding how coerced debt correlates with identity theft. You'll learn how to screen for coerced debt and how to dispute coerced debt. So first of all, to understand coerced debt and identity theft within the context of coerced debt, we need to understand domestic violence and economic abuse. Domestic violence occurs in intimate partner relationships. Usually it's in the context of other forms of coercive control. As you see this wheel here, it is using all different types of behavior to control another person. It's defined by Evan Stark as a pattern of violent acts and their political framework, the pattern of social, institutional, and interpersonal controls that usurp a survivor's capacity to determine her destiny. Battering is linked with social inequality, the systemic nature of oppressions in a particular relationship, and violence is but a moment within a larger context of coercive control. So as you see here, this power and control wheel, there's all different types of acts that include economic abuse, which we'll be focusing on today, but it also can include using emotional abuse, psychological abuse, which is very, very common, isolation, minimizing, denying, blaming, or gaslighting. If there's children that are as a result of the relationship or even from a prior relationship, using those children as a means to control and to force in a way the survivor to do something because of this coercive control, using gender privilege and other types of intimidation, which can include even spiritual or religious abuse, saying, our religion says that you must do X, Y, and Z, and so you can't question me, you must do these things. So economic abuse is one piece of that wheel. And economic abuse is defined pretty broadly. Here it is defined as behaviors that control a person's ability to acquire, use, and maintain economic resources, thus threatening their economic security and potential for self-sufficiency. So this can look like not allowing someone to go to work, for example, or sabotaging them at work. It can include things like depriving access to assets the survivor may already have. So if it's a retirement account or a bank account, not allowing them to access that, or it can include things like, in many of my clients' cases, requiring them to deposit their paycheck into a joint account, but only the abuser has access to that account, depriving the survivor from knowing anything about the financial situation that the household finds itself in. So any debt, any credit, any loans, even if the survivor is on those loans or on that debt. And so economic abuse, because it is so broad, it can cause so many different impacts in the short term and in the long term. This is coined by Erica Sussman and Schoner of the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice as the long-term or the economic ripple effect of domestic violence. So during the relationship, it can include things like, as I mentioned before, job loss, so preventing the survivor from going to a job, sabotaging the job so that they lose it, credit damage, and we'll focus on that a lot today. Theft, so stealing money, stealing assets, incurring debt, causing the survivor to incur debt in order to be able to avoid some of those coercive control patterns, that type of abuse. So, not going to school is another form, like foregone professional advancement. So requiring them to quit school. I had one client, for example, who the abuser coerced her into taking out student loans and then prevented her from being able to actually go to school and use those loans for himself. And then at the point of leaving a relationship, then there's also an economic impact of having to pay for relocation costs. So new housing, new job, transportation. If the survivor and the abuser were married, then costs associated with a divorce, with separation, legal fees, things like that. Um, and in the short term, after leaving that relationship, it's those foregone wages of the job that they had that they no longer have and have to get a new job, that housing instability, increased cost of independent living if they were sharing expenses. And now there's an independent, the survivor's independent and has only her source of income. Then, of course, there's lifetime impacts, mental health effects after the trauma, that from foregoing any professional development, then that kind of slowed delay and the impact on that person and increased vulnerability to future abuse. So domestic violence can lead to poverty, and poverty leads to increased vulnerability. So some of these impacts are really felt through the way that our society now operates. Unfortunately, almost every type of transaction that consumer financial transaction relies on credit reports. So if you have damaged credit, if you have debt, that impacts your ability to get any cell phones, utilities, any loans for, transportation costs like an auto loan, or even for rental. They use credit reports for tenant screening, for jobs and employment screening. They also use credit reports. So that can have an impact on their ability to be financially stable, to be able to get that new job, to be able to get that housing, to be able to get that car that will allow them the mobility to be able to go to work, to drop off the kids at daycare, to go to school, things like that. So coerced debt is a form of economic abuse. As we've shaped and framed this issue, domestic violence, and then is very broad. And then within that very broad coercive control, you have economic abuse, and economic abuse itself covers many behaviors. But one of these is coerced debt. So if you had a Venn diagram, the coerced debt would be within the economic abuse, but it wouldn't be all of economic abuse. And coerced debt itself is defined as any non-consensual credit-related transaction that occurs within an abusive intimate relationship. And there is, as I've noted here in the PowerPoint, there is the notion from where this term came from, was described and was studied within credit-related transactions. But I also see this, and we also see this, those of us who work with survivors in other contexts. So depletion of assets, as I said, stealing money. So that could be from, or non-credit debt. So toll roads, parking debts, things like that, that aren't technically considered that are not technically considered consumer credit, but still have an impact because they, either deprive the survivor of assets by taking money or cause them to be liable for some kind of debt. So within coerced debt, there's two buckets or two mechanisms. Generally, you have the one which is fraud and the other which is coercion/manipulation. So within the fraud bucket, that's where the abuser uses the survivor's identity without their consent or knowledge to obtain money or credit. That's that credit-related transaction. And so this is generally what people think of as identity theft. Like that piece of identity theft is, oh, you don't know about it, you didn't have, any involvement with the transaction, so I took out a bunch of credit cards in your name, or I signed a loan and forged it in your name, things like that. That would be the fraud piece. On the other hand, or the other bucket, you have coercion and manipulation. This is just the coercion piece of the coerced debt, which is where the survivor does whatever the abuser is asking him or her to do, because of the coercive control, right? There's this threat of harm that will happen if the survivor says no. So they use demands and threats. They deliberately manipulate, so they withhold information, or they, many times in my clients' cases, they just said, sign this, do what I tell you to do, don't question me. And especially in many cases where the survivor is, limited English proficient, doesn't speak English, doesn't read or write in English, and just is doing whatever the abuser tells them to do. This is that coercive piece. Generally, we see that within these relationships, there are often times where there are some accounts that are from that fraud piece, the ID theft, no knowledge or permission, consent. And then on the other side, there is coerced accounts where they knew about it, they signed to it, they took it out, but it was because of this pattern of coercive control, the threat of harm, either physical harm to themselves, their children, their pets, and it could be, physical harm as well as psychological, emotional, other types of harm that they were afraid to say no to. Now, how does a survivor actually learn about coerced debt? There's many ways that survivors approach us and come to us, and sometimes they don't even know, exactly that it is coerced debt. They will not use that terminology. They don't know that terminology. So generally, it comes out in different ways that we'll explore in the next slides, but can be through them themselves reviewing a credit report, or getting denied credit for something and realizing it's because they have bad credit. Then they pull their credit report, or they're told to, look at their credit. Or it may be in the process of a divorce proceeding where their attorney has them pull their credit report to divide the marital assets, and then they learn of these accounts they didn't know about. It can also happen through correspondence from a creditor or debt collector. That can be a phone call. That can be letters. So it can even be a suit where they get served with notice of a lawsuit for a debt. I've had clients come in with all of those things, and they would never have said it was coerced debt. It wasn't until I started asking them questions about the debt itself that then we realized that this was something that either they had not consented to at all, didn't know about, or they were forced to do it. They can also find out from an abuser confession, from being contacted by a police investigation, or something else where they find out that they're being garnished for a debt they didn't know about. So I had this client happen with clients as well, that they defaulted on a lawsuit. They didn't know what the lawsuit was about, didn't think it pertained to them. I even had one client whose abuser said, yeah, just sign this, and it was an answer to a lawsuit saying that she agreed she was liable for this debt. Again, she didn't read English, didn't write English, just did what the abuser told her, and then found out that we're garnishing her bank account afterwards. So Texas identity theft law encompasses both pieces of coerced debt. It encompasses that traditional fraud bucket as well as the coerced bucket. This was not always the case. This became the case in 2019, and I'll go through some of those laws in a second. But it's because of the way that identity theft is defined in our law. It encompasses this idea of consent and effective consent. And if there is an effective consent, which I'll go through in a couple of slides, is not present if somebody gives their quote unquote consent because of force or threat or of harm. And so now it encompasses both that coerced piece as well as the fraud piece. So as of 2019, the Texas Penal Code, and you see here section 32.51B, changed the definition to include effective consent. So saying that identity theft, was using someone's personal identifying information without their consent or effective consent in order to obtain some kind of benefit and to harm the other person. That's our penal code definition of identity theft. And then there's also what you guys are working on in this program, in this pilot, is obtaining a 521 orders. What we call 521 orders is through the Texas Business and Commerce Code. That's our civil code on identity theft. And there, the definition changed in 2021. Now, here's how it's defined in the penal code. As I said, they commit an offense if with the intent to defraud another, obtain, possesses, or transfers or uses identifying information of another person without that other person's consent or effective consent. That underlying phrase, effective consent, again, that was changed in 9/1 of 2019. Effective consent is not, or consent is not effective if it's induced by force, threat, or fraud. So again, that coercive control piece over here. Or if it's given by a person who by reason of youth, mental disease or defect or intoxication is known by the actor to be unable to make reasonable decisions. I highlight that, that's part of C, because even though this pilot program is focused on domestic violence, I found that coerced debt can also happen in elder abuse or foster youth cases where maybe a biological parent or an adoptive or foster parent also utilizes coercive control and abusive relationship to take out debt. So we see this kind of dynamic happening in other types of abusive relationships. And so that C could be used as well, that reason of youth, mental disease or defect, if it's somebody who has a cognitive disease as they age. And then in the identity theft in the civil code in Texas Business and Commerce Code, Chapter 521, that was updated in September of 2021. And it tracks the penal definition in penal code definition in some ways. Here it says a person may not obtain, possess, transfer, or use the personal identifying information of another without that person's consent or effective consent, and with intent to obtain a good, a service, insurance, extension of credit, or any other thing of value. And again, here, effective consent is defined or saying, it has to be given by someone who's legally authorized to act on behalf of that person, but it's not effective if induced by force, threat, fraud, or coercion, again, that coercive piece, or given by a person who by reason of youth, mental illness, or intellectual disability is known by the actor to be unable to make reasonable decisions. I wanted to stress that these two laws were passed in 2019 and 2021 because they're going to be really important later on when determining what steps to take about a debt that was coerced. If it was obtained before 2019, you might be limited in some of your options on disputing it. If it was obtained after 2019 but before 2021, you may have certain remedies because of the penal code definition that you may not have because it's not in the civil code. And then, if it was after 2021, you're going to have all kinds of remedies available. And I know Brittany will be going through the Chapter 521 in more depth and what you can do with that. But I want to stress those because of how you can use those pieces in disputing coerced debt under federal law, not just Texas state law, but federal law. And there was another, because of that, there's another option that may be available to a survivor if the debt was obtained before 2019, when that definition changed. If that debt was obtained through credit card or debit card abuse, they may have the ability to still dispute it under, an identity theft report, which we'll get into later, because they can get a police report based on credit card or debit card abuse. And here it tracks the definition of identity theft, but it is specific to if a credit card was used or a debit card was used. So you see here, effective consent is also part of that definition. And you see that it says it has to use a credit or a debit card with the intent to obtain a benefit fraudulently, with knowledge that it was used without the effective consent of the cardholder.